The first bullet tore through the silent forest, embedding itself into the frozen ground just inches from Gideon Shaw's boot. He froze, heart hammering, and instinctively ducked behind a gnarled pine. His breath puffed in thick white clouds, and for a moment, the world seemed suspended. Only the faint, rhythmic whistle of the wind and the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots reminded him that he was alive. Somewhere among the towering pines, a deep, commanding voice muttered in Apache, its tone heavy with anger, warning, and a promise of death. Gideon did not fully understand the words, but he understood the intent. At 35, Gideon had survived more winters and outlaws than he cared to count. He had ridden through dust-choked plains, crossed frozen rivers, and slept in countless abandoned cabins, always alone. And yet, this morning, he was on a mission that felt far riskier than any he had undertaken. A lone Apache woman, rumored to be living beyond the last settlement, had been surviving in isolation for months. The trader who brought him the news had whispered of her tragedy, how she had lost her family years ago, how she had refused any help, how the locals feared her. Some said she was cursed. Others claimed she could kill a man with a glance. Gideon didn't believe in curses. He believed in people. And sometimes he believed in helping those the world had forgotten. Gideon adjusted the strap of his rifle and pressed on through the snow-laden forest. Every tree loomed like a silent sentinel, the branches heavy with frost, each step crunching in protest against the snow that tried to swallow his footprints. Then he saw her. She stood at the edge of a clearing, framed by the smoke of a small fire and the falling snow. Dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, tangled but elegant, and her eyes, sharp and wary, seemed to see through the forest, through Gideon, straight into his intentions. She was tall, wiry, and moving with the silent grace of a predator, every step measured, every movement deliberate. Her cloak, stitched from wolf pelts and soft deer hide, rustled faintly as she turned her gaze toward him. Gideon raised his hand slowly, a gesture of peace. "I mean no harm," he said. His voice was steady, though his chest heaved from the cold and tension. I want to help. I brought lumber, nails, tools, to build you a proper cabin before the storm gets worse." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she turned and gestured for him to follow, leading him to a clearing near a frozen creek. In her arms, she cradled a small bundle. Gideon squinted. Was it a child? A puppy? He couldn't tell. "You don't trust me," he said, trying to break the thick silence. She finally spoke, her voice soft but firm, almost musical. "I trust no one. Not in years. But if you survive the night, maybe we talk." It was not a challenge. It was a fact. And Gideon knew that surviving the night wasn't about staying warm, it was about surviving the forest, the harsh winter, and the people who lurked in its shadows. By evening, he had begun the cabin. Hammering slowly, methodically, he built walls from the logs he had cut earlier. The woman, whom he learned was named Nayeli, watched from a distance, her eyes wary but curious. She did not speak, only observed. He noticed the way her shoulders tensed whenever a branch snapped or the wind howled. Her wariness was instinct, but her gaze held something more, judgment perhaps, or respect for a man who worked as if building a sanctuary rather than just another shelter. As night fell, Gideon had made progress on the rough-hewn cabin. The structure was incomplete, but it was sturdy enough to withstand the immediate chill. He was about to gather kindling for a fire when the crack of a rifle shot shattered the night's fragile peace. The bullet tore through the log wall near his shoulder, splintering wood and sending shards flying. He hit the ground, rolling into the snow, heart hammering like a drum. "Careful," Nayeli hissed, appearing beside him as silently as a shadow. Her hand gripped a knife with expertise. "You shouldn't be here at night. They hunt anyone who helps me." Gideon stared at her. disbelief and adrenaline coursing through him. "Who hunts you?" "An old man," she said, her voice quiet but deadly. "Waya. He thinks I owe him blood. Tomorrow. He comes for anyone who aids me." The weight of her words settled in Gideon's chest. He had survived outlaws, storms, and hunger, but the idea of being hunted simply for offering help was something else entirely. And yet, he had no intention of backing down. "I won't leave," he said, determination hardening his voice. "Not now, not ever. I want to build you a proper home, a place where you can live without fear." Nayeli's eyes softened, just for a moment, before hardening again. "Then we work through the night. And if Waya comes, you do exactly as I say." The hours passed in a tense rhythm. Gideon hammered logs into place, the echo of each strike bouncing through the forest. Nayeli gathered firewood, sharpened knives, and whispered advice in Apache, which Gideon tried to understand. Slowly, they began to communicate not with words, but with gestures, glances, and the shared language of survival. At midnight, the forest grew silent, but the tension never left the cabin. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of wind through the trees a threat. Then, from the darkness beyond the cabin, a branch snapped. Gideon's hand tightened on his rifle. A figure emerged, a man, old, lean, eyes like burning coals, carrying a rifle that had likely killed more than a dozen in its time. "You shouldn't be here," Waya said, his voice low and rough. "Step aside or die." Gideon stood, positioning himself in front of Nayeli. "I don't know you." "Stay back." The old man laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I know enough. And I'll take what's mine, blood or no blood." Nayeli stepped forward, knife gleaming. "Gideon, don't fire yet. He wants you to make the first mistake." The tension stretched like a drawn bow. Snowflakes floated in the lamplight of the half-built cabin, and every moment felt stretched into eternity. Then, in a sudden movement, Waya raised his rifle, and the fight began. Gideon fired first, the bullet tearing into a nearby tree, splinters flying. Waya lunged, swinging the rifle like a club. Nayeli's knife struck his arm with precision, and the old man shrieked, retreating slightly. Snow and chaos filled the clearing as Gideon tackled him. Rolling in the icy snow, the struggle was fierce and close. Breath steaming in the cold air, limbs tangled. The metallic scent of blood sharp and bitter. Nayeli shouted directions, her voice slicing through the storm of movement. "The cliff! If he catches you, go down. He can't follow without falling." Gideon acted without thinking, rolling toward the hidden cliffside, dragging Waya along. Nayeli pushed from behind, and the old man lost balance, clinging to a root as his legs dangled over the edge. "I'll be back," Waya screamed, fury in his eyes. Before vanishing into the forest shadows, Gideon slumped in the snow, chest heaving, snow clinging to bloodied clothing. Nayeli knelt beside him, her hand brushing snow from his face. "He'll return," she said quietly, eyes solemn. "And next time, we may not survive." Gideon looked at her, exhausted, shaken, yet resolute. "Then we prepare," he said. "We finish this cabin and we survive together." The night deepened, the forest held its breath, and the first part of a story that would test their courage, trust, and very survival had only just begun. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the snow-laden clearing. Gideon Shaw pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, the chill biting through his woolen layers, and stared at the half-built cabin. The rough walls had taken shape overnight, but it was far from finished. Every plank he hammered, every log he secured, felt like a small victory against both the harsh winter and the danger lurking beyond the tree line. Nayeli moved beside him, her eyes alert, constantly scanning the forest. She had been silent for most of the morning, her knife in hand, the snow crunching softly under her boots. "Waya won't wait long," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, though the tone carried the weight of certainty. "He's patient, but he doesn't forgive. He doesn't forget." Gideon nodded, setting down his hammer. "Then we finish this cabin. It has to be strong enough to hold against anything he brings." He wiped the sweat and snow from his brow, his breath rising in clouds. He had been through blizzards, outlaws, and near starvation, but the thought of facing a man consumed entirely by vengeance unnerved him in a way nothing else had. Nayeli's eyes flicked toward him, dark and unreadable. "You don't know him. He is relentless. He's old, but he is cunning, and he knows this forest like it's part of his soul." Gideon picked up another plank and tested its weight. "I may not know him," he said slowly, "but I know I'm not leaving you to face him alone." She glanced at him, a shadow of a smile flickering before vanishing. She had survived on her own for years, relying on stealth, intelligence, and the knowledge that trust was a liability. Yet somehow, she felt the pull of Gideon's determination. She had watched him work through the night, his hands raw, his breath steaming in the freezing air. And she had seen something she hadn't seen in years' unyielding purpose. A quiet strength that demanded respect. The hours passed with laborious rhythm. Gideon fitted the last of the logs for the cabin's walls, while Nayeli prepared braces and supports, her movements precise and efficient. Snow drifted around them in fine, white sheets, settling on their coats and hair, but they barely noticed. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every rustle of branches or falling icicle magnified in the cold silence. The only sounds were the rhythm of hammer on wood and the soft scraping of knife against timber. By midday, the cabin had taken a solid form, walls high and roof supports in place. Gideon laid a rough floor of pine boughs and flattened branches, the resinous scent of the forest mixing with the coppery tang of blood from minor scrapes and cuts. Nayeli arranged a small hearth, stacking firewood in neat bundles, her movements careful and deliberate. For a moment, the cabin seemed less like a mere structure and more like a sanctuary, a fragile symbol of safety amidst the unforgiving winter. Then the first movement came, a subtle shift in the shadows beyond the trees. Gideon froze, gripping his rifle, eyes scanning the snow for any sign of motion. Nayeli stiffened beside him, her knife in her hand, the pale light reflecting in her eyes. "They are close," she whispered. "He's watching, waiting for an opening." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure there isn't one." He adjusted the rifle strap, weighing each thought carefully. He had faced many adversaries, but a man driven entirely by vengeance, with knowledge of the land and the patience to wait, posed a different threat. Hours dragged on, the tension stretching taut. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of snow in the trees sent adrenaline coursing through their veins. They ate little, moved only when necessary, and kept their eyes fixed on the forest's edge. Waya did not reveal himself immediately. He was cunning, biding his time, observing from a distance. And Gideon and Nayeli knew that the first mistake could be fatal. By evening, Waya appeared at the tree line, his lean frame barely visible in the dimming light. He carried only his rifle, his movements careful but deliberate. His eyes, sharp and unforgiving, locked on the cabin and then on them. The old man's mouth twisted into a bitter, cold smile, a reflection of the hatred that had fueled him for decades. "You think a cabin can save you?" he rasped, his voice low and rough, carrying over the snow-laden clearing. Gideon stood firm. "It's not just a cabin. It's shelter, safety, and enough fight to keep you from taking what isn't yours." Waya's grin widened. "I will take it, and I will take you. Blood debts must be repaid." With that, the old man raised his rifle, and the forest erupted into chaos. Gideon fired first, the bullet slamming into a nearby tree and sending shards of bark flying. Waya ducked and returned fire, each shot precise, aimed to intimidate rather than wound. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder, pine resin, and snow, and the forest seemed to shrink around them, every shadow a potential threat. Nayeli moved like a shadow herself, knife in hand. She struck at Waya when he aimed again, grazing his arm, drawing a hiss of pain. He recoiled and advanced, swinging the rifle like a club. Gideon dove behind the cabin logs, returning fire when he saw an opening. The snow became a battlefield, pocked with footprints, splintered wood, and the bitter tang of blood. Hours passed in this deadly rhythm, each moment stretching into eternity. Gideon realized that the fight was not just brute strength, it was strategy, patience, and instinct. Waya was relentless, but the cabin and the forest gave Gideon and Nayeli advantages. Concealment, traps, and their ability to anticipate his moves kept them alive. Finally, Gideon spotted a hidden path leading to a steep embankment along the creek. He shouted to Nayeli, "The cliff! He can't follow there!" Nayeli nodded, drawing Waya's attention with a quick movement of her knife. Gideon seized the moment, grabbing Waya and tackling him toward the hidden path. The old man lost his footing, hands clawing at roots as his legs dangled over the cliff. "I'll be back!" Waya screamed, fury in his voice. Before disappearing into the gray forest shadows, Gideon sank to the snow, chest heaving, muscles trembling from exertion. Nayeli knelt beside him, brushing snow from his coat. "He'll return," she said softly. "But not yet. Not in this storm." For a long moment neither spoke. The forest returned to its quiet, the snow drifting gently over the clearing, erasing footprints, softening edges, as if trying to hide the violence that had occurred. Gideon's gaze moved to the cabin, the half-built structure now feeling more like a shield than mere wood and nails. "Tomorrow, we finish it," he said finally, voice low and resolute. "And we prepare. He'll come back, and we'll be ready." Nayeli's eyes softened, a shadow of her usual vigilance giving way to a flicker of trust. "You've done more than anyone else would have," she admitted. "For that, I trust you." Gideon felt the weight of her words, knowing how rare such trust was for her. They spent the rest of the night repairing damage, reinforcing weak points, and stacking firewood in preparation for what was to come. Each movement was deliberate, each decision a silent acknowledgement that survival depended on precision and unity. By the time the fire had burned low, a fragile sense of calm settled over the cabin. They sat side by side, faces red from the cold and exertion, letting the quiet fill the spaces where words were unnecessary. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the pines. But inside, the small cabin offered warmth, shelter, and hope. Gideon realized that survival had become more than enduring the cold or evading Waya. It was about trust, about partnership, and about carving a space where life could continue despite the threats that loomed outside. Nayeli's presence beside him was no longer just a responsibility, it was a bond, forged through shared danger and perseverance. For now, they had survived. For now, the cabin stood, a fragile yet defiant testament to their determination. And though Waya would return, Gideon knew that he and Nayeli were no longer just individuals surviving the frontier, they were a team, ready to face whatever storm, threat, or shadow the wilderness could throw at them. The first part of their fight had ended, but the winter, Waya's wrath, and the unyielding forest held many more tests in store. And Gideon, for the first time in years, felt the weight of purpose heavier than fear, a commitment to see this fight through, no matter the cost. The snow had deepened over the past week, settling in thick blankets that muffled footsteps but made every movement more exhausting. The cabin Gideon and Nayeli had built now stood complete, sturdy, and insulated, its roof heavy with snow, its walls reinforced with extra logs and branches. Inside, the hearth glowed with warmth, smoke curling upward and filling the small space with the scent of pine and firewood. Outside, the forest was a silent, white expanse, a labyrinth of shadows and frozen trees, hiding both predators and secrets. Gideon sat near the hearth, cleaning his rifle, the metal cold against his fingers, while Nayeli sharpened her knife, the rhythmic scrape echoing in the quiet cabin. They had established a routine: work, watch, prepare, repeat. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of wind, could carry Waya's approach. "He won't wait much longer," Nayeli said, eyes dark with concentration. "Old men can be patient, but he's smart enough to know the snow won't hide him forever. Soon he'll come, and he'll bring others." Gideon nodded. "Then we prepare for that. Traps, ambush points, the creek edge. We use everything to our advantage." They moved through the cabin methodically, reinforcing the walls, camouflaging paths, and setting simple yet effective traps in the snow surrounding the clearing. Every log, every nail, every rope served a purpose. Nayeli instructed him with precision, demonstrating how to hide pitfalls, how to lure an attacker to vulnerable ground, and how to use the terrain to their benefit. Gideon listened and adapted, learning quickly, his hands and mind working in tandem with hers. Evening fell, and the first real storm of winter arrived. Snow fell in thick sheets, the wind cutting through the pines like a knife. Visibility dropped to mere yards, and the temperature sank sharply. The cabin, though warm inside, rattled under the wind's pressure, forcing them to check every window, door, and crack. Hours passed, the storm relentless, until a distant snap of wood reached their ears, barely audible over the howl of the wind. Gideon's hand went to his rifle immediately. Nayeli's eyes narrowed. "He's here," she said quietly. "Waya, and he's not alone." Through the white blur, figures emerged, shadowy forms moving with purpose. Waya, lean and unforgiving, led a small group of mercenaries, all of them armed, all of them familiar with the forest and winter's treachery. The storm made them hard to see, but impossible to ignore. Gideon and Nayeli moved to their positions, each understanding instinctively where the other would be. Gideon took the rifle near the cabin's reinforced corner, while Nayeli positioned herself near a hidden pit, the knife in her hand. They shared no words, only a look of understanding. Their coordination, honed through days of preparation, was silent and perfect. Waya approached deliberately, scanning the cabin, his eyes burning with hatred. "Step out," he called, voice rough and commanding. "You cannot hide from me forever." Gideon answered with a shot that struck a nearby tree, sending a shower of snow and splinters into the air. Waya flinched, cursed, and barked orders to his men. The winter siege had begun. The forest became a deadly maze. Snow masked movement, shadows concealed attacks, and the bitter cold added fatigue to fear. Each step Waya took was countered by traps, hidden pits that swallowed boots, snares that jerked arms violently, and rigged logs that fell with calculated force. One mercenary fell heavily into a concealed hole near the creek, his shout muffled by the storm. Another tripped over a rope Gideon had laid, landing hard in the snow. Waya's patience began to crack. He barked orders and moved with increasing aggression, but Gideon and Nayeli used the storm as their ally. Every gust of wind, every swirling snowflake worked to mask their positions, confuse the attackers, and turn the forest into a fortress. Hours of careful maneuvering passed. Gideon fired shots with precision, aiming not just to hit but to herd Waya's men into traps. Nayeli moved like a shadow, striking and retreating, her knife leaving shallow but painful cuts, forcing their attackers to slow down, to falter. It was exhausting, the cold numbing their hands and feet. their muscles screaming, yet they continued, knowing that survival depended on endurance as much as strategy. Finally, Waya broke through the outer defenses, his fury evident. "You think your tricks will save you," he shouted, advancing toward the cabin with relentless force. His rifle barked, and Gideon returned fire, striking a tree near his foot. Snow sprayed like powder as bullets met bark. Nayeli's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Gideon, the cliff. Lead him there." Gideon seized the moment, maneuvering Waya toward the hidden embankment along the creek. The old man's eyes widened, realizing too late that he was being led into a trap. Nayeli's knife flashed, cutting ropes and snapping tensioned branches to block his retreat. Waya stumbled, hands clawing at roots and ice as his legs dangled over the cliffside. "You may have won this time," he hissed, teeth clenched, "but I will return. You cannot hide forever." The forest remembers. I remember. Gideon watched as Waya finally fell backward into the snow, gripping a root long enough to save himself from the full drop. He disappeared into the storm, leaving Gideon and Nayeli in the cabin, battered but alive. The wind howled outside, snow piling high against the walls, but inside, the cabin remained their sanctuary. Both sank to the floor, exhausted, bodies aching, clothes soaked and frozen. The fire crackled faintly, its warmth a small comfort against the relentless cold. "We survived," Gideon said, voice low, almost a whisper. "But he'll be back." "He always comes back." Nayeli nodded, a faint shadow of a smile appearing on her face. "Yes, but so will we. And next time, we will be ready for him, for anything he brings." They spent the rest of the night repairing minor damages, reinforcing the walls, and checking traps. The storm outside showed no mercy, but inside, the two of them moved in quiet coordination, their bond deepened by the fight. They spoke little, letting actions convey trust and understanding. Every glance, every nod, was a silent promise to protect each other, to survive together. Hours later, as the storm waned, Gideon looked at Nayeli. "We've made it through the worst of the night. But Waya won't stop. How long can he keep this up?" She studied him, eyes reflecting firelight and determination. "As long as it takes. Men like him do not tire easily. But neither do we. We've learned the land. We've learned the storm. We will survive because we must." The snow settled, leaving the clearing eerily quiet. Footprints had been erased, evidence of the battle hidden beneath fresh layers of white. Gideon and Nayeli sat together by the fire, their breath slowing, hands warming against the warmth of the hearth and each other. They had endured the siege, proven themselves against Waya's cunning, but they knew this was only the beginning. Outside, the forest seemed to watch them, its silence both a warning and a comfort. Gideon realized that survival was no longer just about the forest or Waya, it was about trust, strategy, and the bond that had formed between him and Nayeli. They had faced death together, and in that crucible, something unspoken had taken root: respect, understanding, and the faintest spark of hope that went beyond mere survival died as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the storm clouds. Gideon and Nayeli prepared for what would come next. They had fortified the cabin, laid traps, and learned the forest's secrets. Waya might return with vengeance in his heart, but they were ready, not just to fight, but to endure, to survive, and to turn the wilderness and winter into allies rather than enemies. For now, the cabin stood, a stronghold against the elements and the old man's fury. Gideon and Nayeli, exhausted but unbroken, allowed themselves a rare moment of quiet. The winter siege had tested them, pushed them to the brink, and shown them the depth of their strength. And though Waya would not stay away forever, they had proven that even in the harshest wilderness, even against the fiercest vengeance, survival was possible, and for Gideon, the realization settled deep in his chest. This fight, this struggle, was not just about protecting Nayeli or the cabin. It was about forging something enduring, something stronger than fear or blood debts, a bond of trust and resilience that would carry them through whatever storms, snow, or shadows the Old West could throw at them. The forest outside remained silent, snow drifting like fine dust over the clearing. But inside, by the fire, Gideon and Nayeli sat ready for the next attack, ready for the trials to come, and ready to face Waya again, whatever it might cost. The morning air was crisp and biting, the kind that stung exposed skin and turned breath into clouds of mist. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow over the forest, masking footprints and erasing signs of the previous night's struggle. Gideon and Nayeli emerged from the cabin cautiously, scanning the surrounding trees. Every shadow, every glimmer of dark bark against the snow, held the potential for danger. Waya had not returned yet, but his presence was a lingering threat, an unseen weight that pressed on them even in the quiet. Gideon adjusted the strap of his rifle and tightened the fur-lined gloves over his hands. "He's out there," he said, his voice low. "Watching, waiting. He won't give up." Nayeli's eyes were narrowed, scanning the forest. "I know. And he won't attack recklessly. Not yet. He wants to lure us out, make us make a mistake. He's patient, and he believes he's smarter than we are. But he doesn't know us." The cabin behind them stood strong, a testament to their labor, their strategy, and their resolve. Gideon had reinforced the walls with extra logs, hidden the path along the creek with false footprints, and strengthened the snow-laden roof. Every detail mattered. Survival depended on precision. Nayeli had helped imperfect snares, sharpened stakes, and hidden pitfalls, turning the forest itself into a weapon. Hours passed with cautious observation. Birds occasionally stirred in the distance, the wind whispered through the pines, and the snow crunched faintly under the weight of unseen movement. Then, near the edge of the clearing, a shadow appeared, slender, hunched, yet purposeful. Waya had returned, alone this time, his eyes hard and unyielding. He carried only a rifle, but the tension in his posture spoke of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of vengeance. "You think the forest hides you?" Waya rasped, voice carrying through the clearing like gravel. "I know where you are, and I know your tricks. Step out, and maybe I'll give you a quick death. Or stay hidden, and I will burn it all down." Gideon stepped slightly forward, rifle leveled but not raised to fire. "We're done hiding," he said, his voice firm. "You've had your chance. Leave us, and this ends peacefully." Waya's bitter laugh cut through the cold. "Peaceful? That word doesn't exist for me. Blood debt must be repaid. You, the woman, all of it. You cannot escape." The tension exploded into action. Waya fired a warning shot that embedded itself in a tree near the cabin. Snow and bark sprayed, and Gideon returned fire, striking near his feet as he moved into a more strategic position. The old man was cunning, anticipating their movements, but Gideon had learned from the winter siege. Each step he took was calculated, designed to drive Waya toward the traps they had set days ago. Nayeli emerged from the cabin side, knife in hand, moving like a shadow. She circled silently, drawing Waya's attention, luring him closer to the cliffside along the creek. Gideon fired again, forcing Waya back slightly, while Nayeli pressed forward, her knife flashing in the sunlight reflecting off the snow. Waya's fury became palpable. "You think you can outsmart me?" he shouted. "I have survived worse winters, harsher forests, and greater enemies than you." "You survived," Gideon called back, voice steady, "but you never learned when to stop. That's your mistake." The old man lunged, and Nayeli darted to the side, avoiding his rifle barrel while Gideon moved along the embankment. Waya tripped over one of the concealed snares, momentarily losing balance. Gideon seized the moment, pressing forward, his hands grabbing Waya as he teetered near the edge. The old man struggled violently, but the weight of the snow, the frozen ground, and Gideon's grip made it impossible to regain control. "You don't understand," Waya screamed, claws digging into roots, eyes blazing. "Blood must be paid. It's over," Gideon shouted, muscles straining. "Not today, not ever." With a final push, Waya lost his grip on the last root and tumbled down the embankment, sliding over ice and snow until he came to rest against the creek's edge. The cold water lapped at his body, the ice pressing against his arms, leaving him momentarily stunned and vulnerable. Gideon and Nayeli approached cautiously, rifles and knives at the ready. But it was clear that the old man was beaten not by bullets alone, but by the relentless strategy, preparation, and unity of those he had sought to destroy. Gideon crouched near him, eyes sharp. "Do you yield?" Waya's lips curled in a bitter, defeated snarl, but his strength had left him. He glared at them, breathing heavily, frost coating his hair and beard. "This isn't the end," he rasped. "For you?" Gideon asked. "Yes, for us?" "No." Nayeli stepped forward, her knife lowered but still ready. "Go home, Waya. Leave us in peace. You can survive this, but you will not harm us again." For a long moment, Waya said nothing, shivering in the icy water, the firelight from the cabin reflecting off the snow. Then, slowly, he looked up, eyes dark but grudgingly resigned. With a grunt, he pulled himself out of the creek, sloshing through the snow, and disappeared into the forest. This time, Gideon knew he would not return. At least, not for vengeance. The forest settled back into silence, broken only by the distant calls of birds and the soft whisper of the wind. Gideon and Nayeli stood in the clearing, chests heaving, adrenaline ebbing into exhaustion. They had faced the relentless threat, survived the siege, and emerged stronger, bonded not only by survival but by trust, strategy, and mutual respect. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire seemed to wrap around them like a shield against both the cold and the memory of the past day's violence. Gideon sank onto the floor, exhausted but relieved. Nayeli sat beside him, her knife now resting on the wooden table, eyes softening as she looked at him. "You were right," she said quietly. "About him. About us. About surviving together." Gideon smiled faintly, brushing snow from her cloak. "We didn't just survive. We endured, and we'll endure anything that comes after this." For the first time in years, Nayeli allowed herself to relax completely. The constant vigilance, the tension, the unyielding threat of Waya's vengeance, all of it had receded, leaving a fragile but growing sense of peace. The cabin, their work, and their unity had become more than just survival. It was home. Days passed, and the forest, now quiet and seemingly at peace, allowed them to rebuild their lives. They stocked the cabin with firewood, trapped food, and supplies for the coming winter. Gideon taught Nayeli small tricks he had learned on the frontier, while she shared her knowledge of the forest and the ways of the land. Their skills complemented each other, blending into a partnership that was unbreakable, forged through shared danger and triumph. One morning, with the sun bright and the snow sparkling like crystals, they stepped outside together, surveying the clearing. The forest was calm, the only movement the distant rustle of trees and occasional birdsong. Gideon took a deep breath, letting the cold fill his lungs, and looked at Nayeli. "We did it," he said simply. She nodded, a rare smile breaking across her face. "Yes, we did." They had faced Waya, the wilderness, and the winter itself, and they had survived. More than that, they had built a life together in a world that had once seemed merciless. The cabin, now complete and fortified, stood as a testament to their determination. Courage and unity died as the days turned into weeks. The memory of Waya's threats faded into the background, replaced by the rhythm of life in the forest. Gideon and Nayeli hunted, trapped, and tended to the cabin, their bond growing stronger with each shared task and quiet conversation. They laughed together, planned for the future, and allowed themselves the rare luxury of hope, a thing that had seemed impossible in the early days of their encounter. One evening, as the sun set behind the snow-dusted pines, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Gideon and Nayeli sat outside the cabin, hands clasped, watching the forest's beauty. The long battle, the sieges, and the fear had passed, leaving only the promise of peace and the strength of a partnership forged in adversity. Gideon spoke softly, almost to himself. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Nayeli's hand squeezed his. "Yes, together." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke, a reminder of the storm they had weathered and the life they had built. And in the quiet, under the vast expanse of the winter sky, they knew that they had survived not just the threat of Waya, but the isolation, fear, and harshness of the frontier. They had endured and they had triumphed. The forest, once a place of danger and uncertainty, had become a sanctuary. The cabin, once a refuge against the elements, had become a home. And Gideon and Nayeli, bound by trust, courage, and shared hardship, had forged a life together in a world that had once seemed determined to keep them apart. For the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine the future not as fugitives, not as hunted, but as partners, survivors, and friends bound by choice, not circumstance. The past was behind them. Waya's threat had ended. And in the quiet of the forest, with snow crunching softly beneath their boots and the warmth of the fire behind them, Gideon and Nayeli looked ahead, ready for whatever life in the Old West would bring next.